I welcome you back to your YouTube channel, and in this video we will be talking about another data fallacy that needs to be avoided, that is survivorship bias. So before we move on, let us try to understand the application context for the survivorship bias. The application context is coming from the World War, when planes used to fly to the enemy territories and they used to bombard the territories. In some cases, they also used to get hit by the enemies and then they used to crash. However, most of the planes they used to return to the bases, and when they used to return to the bases, they used to get inspected by the technical team. Okay, so when technical team used to inspect the planes regarding what areas they have been hit the most, they try to reinforce those areas. However, it was observed that there was no need to reinforce the areas that have been hit because they were already resilient. Otherwise, the planes would not have returned to the base, right? So now a consensus was made that instead of reinforcing the areas that have been hit, we should be reinforcing the areas that have not been hit, because those areas were actually responsible for the crash of the planes, right? So this was the basics of survivorship bias. So the idea was we have to reinforce the points that have not been hit, because those points were actually responsible for the plane crashes. Okay, so when it comes to psychology or data science, what survivorship bias is, it is basically a logical error. And what is going to happen is, because of this logical error, we are going to focus only on the success stories, and while discounting the underlying failures. So any endeavor, there are a lot of success stories and there are equal, actually more number of failures. Okay, so because of this survivorship bias, we are more likely to glorify the success stories while discounting the failure stories. Okay, so because of this, it distorts our understanding, and we start to believe that in most of the cases success is usually the rule. However, as we already know that in most of the endeavors, success stories form a minority. Okay, and lot of mistakes, lot of failures, they are going to take most of the space. So because of this survivorship bias, we are only given, or we are only told the success stories, and then we start to believe that in most of the cases we are also going to get success. So this is the basis of survivorship bias. So when it comes to data science and machine learning, how this survivorship bias is going to affect our modeling, it is going to affect our modeling in multiple ways. So what is going to happen in data science and machine learning? Important and non-existing points are ignored together. So survivorship bias can creep into your model when you have ignored important but non-existent points. And what you have believed, you have simply believed that those data points do not contribute to information. However, this is not correct, because there could be a lot of points that have not been put in the modeling process, which could actually have contained more amount of information. So because of this selection bias, lot of information is getting lost, and the model that we are going to obtain at the end will not be too much generalizable. Okay, and this overcoming survivorship bias in most of the cases can become very much challenging, because particularly when we are given a lot of data points that conform to a particular hypothesis. So in those situations, when we are inundated with a lot of data points conforming to a particular hypothesis, we are more likely to believe that okay, those are the only data points available for us to train the model, while in reality this is not the case. So what is going to happen is, we have to go for a strategy that is taking into account the data points that are relevant to the modeling, instead of the data points that are only presented to us. Okay, so what could be the consequence? The consequence is basically a result of selection and cognitive bias. So first of all, there is selection bias going on, because we are only looking at the successful data points. We are basically looking for the data points that some way fit a particular hypothesis, and we are ignoring all other data points. And because of this selection bias, there is a cognitive bias as a consequence, because now with those data points we are more likely to believe that those data points are the only points which are available for us in order to model the data. So what are the effects of this survivorship bias? Primarily there will be two different effects. First of all, the model is going to draw incorrect preferences. Okay, so the model is going to believe that the data points that it has been trained on are the only data points that it will be seeing in the real world. However, it turns out that in most of the cases we already know that when a model is being deployed in the real world, it is more likely to experience, or it is more likely to see the data points that it was not trained on. Okay, so on in these kind of situations, the model is more likely to give incorrect predictions. In another branch, it can also go for incorrect causality determination. So what is going to make is, it is going to conclude that the data points that are included for the modeling stage, they have been affected by the selection strategy. While in reality, we already know that this is not the case. Those points are there in the modeling process just because they qualified that particular selection criterion, and that they were not in general affected by the selection process. Okay, so now that we have understood the basis of survivorship bias, let us also try to understand what are the different avoidance strategies. So the first thing that I would suggest is that before you go for any data analysis, think about the data that is not present and should have been. So it is very tempting to look at the data, to analyze the data, and then go for modeling. However, what I suggest is that one must also go for looking at the data points that have not been put in the modeling stage. And one should also satisfy himself or herself as to why those data points are not there in the modeling stage. So the idea that I'm trying to bring out is that one must also justify the selection process that led to the inclusion of those data points for the modeling purpose. Okay, and if you find out that there is some flaw in the selection process, and then there are data points that should have been there in the modeling stage, I would suggest that you reconsider the selection strategy to include those data points also for the modeling stage. And once you have included those data points also, it is better to create multiple cross folds and to check the model for any bias. So when you have included more data, then you have a bigger chunk of data to model the data to build your model. So when you are training the model, it is better that you create multiple folds and then also rigorously check the data for any possible bias. Okay, so if I were to put everything in a nutshell, what we can say is that survivorship bias basically occurs when we look at the data we have and then we ignore the selection process, because there must have been a selection process that have included some data points and would have excluded other data points. So that selection strategy must also be properly introspected. Okay, now, there are some key observations that I would like to highlight or summarize at the end of this tutorial. Uh, Surviving observations often tend to have survived because they had resilience to difficult situations. What it means in context to data science? In context to data science, it basically means that the data points that are available for us to train the model, they have somehow passed the selection criterion. So the only thing we have to check is the validity or the correctness of that selection start process. Okay, and then it is going to lead to results that are positively skewed, because we are more likely to see success data points, we are more likely to see the data points that are bound to conform to a hypothesis, and in this event we are likely to lose the information that would have been gained from the other data points also. So with this, I think we must realize that the onus must be on the database managers to make sure that whatever data set they are creating for the modeling purpose, they are free from these kind of biases, because these biases are going to eventually affect the generalization performance of the model in the real world. Okay, so I hope you have got some basic insights to what this survivorship bias is all about. In case you have any queries, feel free to put it in the comments. I will be more than happy to answer those queries. So now with this, I think it's time for me to sign off. If you like this video, consider subscribing and sharing it with your friends.